Good evening. So if I was Donald Trump, I'd look out and be seeing a huge crowd right now, but I'm not. I'm Janet Zlotnick. I'm the president of the Public Education Network Society, or PENS. On behalf of our group and our panelists, thanks for braving the weather and coming out this evening. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish Nations. Before we move on to our panelists, let me first tell you a little bit about PENS. The genesis of our group was the Charter for Public Education, which was founded in 2004 to continue the dialogue that began with the public hearings culminating in the Charter for Public Education. Over time, the name of the group was changed to PENS to avoid association with the American charter school movement. PENS is a diverse group of citizens who share the Charter's vision for public education, advocate for its principles, and engage with communities in meaningful dialogue about education. If you aren't familiar with the Charter, there are copies on the table at the back, or you can download one from our website. While many of you here this evening don't need convincing of the value of public education, we hope that what we discuss will provide valuable perspectives from which to think through these issues, cast some vision, and prompt practical steps towards realizing a public education system that does indeed keep the covenant with future generations. I'll also note that tonight's program is being recorded for use as video in social media by Your Education Matters. If you're interested in using any of the videos with a PAC or a PD Day event or a community group, please do contact Professor Paul Shaker. You can submit questions via text. We're sort of experimenting with that. And all you have to do is text 37607, and then the message is Janet Zlotnick 580. And then you can just start texting your questions and they'll actually show up on the screen. We'll be doing that after every second couple of speakers. So if you want to experiment with that, it'd be great. If you're more of a hands-on, tactile kind of person, we do have Post-it notes and Sharpies at the back. You can put those up on the board there, and the camera maybe can pan later so we can capture some of your ideas, thoughts, and questions. What we're thinking is after each pair speaks, I'll take one or two questions, depending on time, either from the text or from the board, and answer it at that time. And then at the end of when the panelists have finished, you can line up at the microphone and ask your questions at that time. So now to our panel. Our first question this evening is, what are the purposes of public education? Which will be addressed first by Michael Zlotnick, and then by Trish Garner, who will respond to Mike and then take up the question herself. Mike's granddaughter, 13-year-old granddaughter, was going to join him this evening, but she's actually sick. And so I will be playing the role of the 13-year-old granddaughter. Mike?
Well, good evening. While some things are better today in 2017 than they were in the past, social equality has stalled in British Columbia. Children do not have equal access to high-quality public education. Moreover, there are pedagogical issues in current schooling that undermine students' capacities to govern themselves and to improve the social order. Most alarmingly, the political system is not working either to equalize the material conditions of children or to ensure that the purposes, principles, and pedagogy of public education support a more egalitarian and democratic society in the future. Therefore, we need to consider political strategies that are longer term than the next election and that build broad consensus in our province in favor of equal opportunities for all children to get a high-quality public education and to participate as citizens. We need to find ways for the citizens, parents, students, and teachers to have a more powerful voice in these critical decisions about the nature of our society, the purposes and principles of public schooling, and the adequacy of the resources applied to public schooling. Our objective for this presentation is to take a leap of imagination into the future, a future that will have addressed many of the concerns now frustrating people today. The point is to consider some longer-term strategies, not as a substitute for short-term actions, but as an ongoing process of changing the culture, ethos, and zeitgeist of our province, so we can do what a genuine democratic society would do. How long will it take to make equal access to high-quality public education available to all children? The sooner, the better. We hope that progress will come faster, but I've chosen 2079, 62 years from now, and when February 6th will also be on a Monday. So,
Grandpa, our textbook on public education says in the early part of the 21st century, many BC children lived in poverty and the funding for public education was inadequate. Wasn't that stupid?
our province suffered from many great inequalities. While many people were fairly comfortable, some were extremely rich, many others were poor.
Is it really true that there was school fundraising for books, computers, and other necessary stuff? That's crazy. How can you call that public education? It isn't fair at all. What was wrong with your generation?
Ooh, it was a time of overall economic affluence, but also mean-spirited selfishness. Of course, many of us thought differently and tried to convince the government to put a higher priority on public education. However, we were frustrated by the political system. We did not know what to do when government said they didn't have more money for public schools, post-secondary education, overcoming poverty, etc. Many people could not see the connection between honoring a sacred covenant for each new generation and building democracy. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what to do about it other than beg the government for more money. The schooling of older generations was part of the problem, even though much of our history had shown the benefits of local democratic control over schooling. It was being clawed back so that many of the powers of school boards were taken away by government.
So that's why there was the pedagogical insurrection. We're just starting to learn about that in school. I guess with all the unfairness, you guys were fed up. Look what it says in my textbook.
Well, by 2020, there was a growing pedagogical insurrection in British Columbia. Groups of parents, students, teachers, and pro-democratic citizens decided to become much more active in the struggle for more funds and greater equality in public education, but also with respect to pedagogy. The pedagogical insurrection supported students exercising more say in their own education and equipped students with the means to learn proactively under a variety of learning conditions. While this made some very uncomfortable, gradually people began to see the value of this proactive and transformative pedagogy, which could be implemented without the permission of government. Public attitudes towards children shifted such that all children were eventually lifted out of poverty and provided with superbly funded and resourced public schools.
It's good that eventually you guys figured it out. How did it work?
Well, we continued petitioning and lobbying government. We gave much more attention to winning the hearts and minds of our families, neighbors, co-workers, and fellow citizens. We saw the irony in public schools being directed by governments not committed to social equality. We took the initiative over what and how students were to learn. Because it arose locally, the pedagogical insurrection strengthened local democratic governance of public education. As the voices of the local citizens gained influence, resources for public schools were more generously provided.
Grandpa, they did good things, but talk about a pedagogical insurrection sounds a bit creepy, like conspiracy and terrorists.
Maybe there's a better term, but it was necessary for people, the public, to insert themselves into the public schools. The insurrection encouraged students, their parents, and teachers to work out the purposes and principles that would serve the kind of society they wanted to live in.
But you guys finally figured out the covenantal part, right? Look what it says in my textbook.
It says, eventually, the citizens of British Columbia recognized that public education was a crucial institution for building covenantal democracy. In earlier times and other parts of the world, there were class systems in which the class you were born into was a major factor in your chances of flourishing. In a covenantal democracy, the combination of social policy and education policy works to ensure equal opportunity. The term covenant means we all promise to one another and to all generations to come that our country will provide everyone with equal opportunity.
It took you guys long enough, but at least things are better now.
There is much more understanding today that we're talking about the minds of human beings. Just as the 18th century Enlightenment denied the nation authority over religion, the pedagogical insurrection denied the nation or the province unfettered power to shape the minds of citizens. If we want free individuals to form an ethical, just, peaceful, and inclusive society, we have to make the ideas of truth, goodness, and justice central to what we study and learn, but do so in a climate of free inquiry. People were a lot more fearful then. Some feared education and freedom would undermine the authority of the state. However, the Charter called for each generation to shape and build its society.
It's hard to believe all this stuff, but things sure are better now. Thanks, everyone, for fighting for equality and well-funded public schools. I'm no longer 13. Okay, I'd now like to introduce Trish Garner.
Great to be here tonight. Again, thank you for those who've braved the unfortunate weather. We really appreciate you being here. So as Janet said, I'm Trish Garner, and I'm the community organizer with the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. So I'm going to pick up and build on some of Mike's points without a 13-year-old granddaughter, particularly around the relationship between democracy and education. My son's soul was being crushed. That sounds dramatic, and I'm not usually that way, but that's what was happening at school, and that's why we pulled my son and his twin brother out of school last year. Finn was wandering the hallway, visiting the bathroom a lot, the water fountains, over and over again. Perhaps expected behavior for a teenager, maybe, but not for a 6-year-old. They said he wasn't keeping up with the grade requirements for reading. He does have reading challenges, but he was being defined by this so-called failure and not seen for any of his other strengths. His intense interest in politics, his single-mindedness, his love for music and martial arts, and combining the two at every opportunity, sort of a ninja dance thing. We thought to ourselves, it doesn't have to be this way. The problem wasn't the teacher or the school. The problem is a very broken system of public education, underfunded to the point of desperation, with overcrowded classrooms where students become, by necessity, problems to be managed, not burgeoning people to be nurtured, where there are so many needs that no one's can be met adequately, not the kid at the top of the class or the kid at the bottom or any of those in between, where schools have really had the life sucked out of them through the loss of teacher librarians, music rooms, art programs, the list goes on. And where public education has been reduced to job training. But it doesn't have to be this way. We urgently need to reimagine public education. And to do that, we need to recognize and challenge at least two important underlying features of our current framework. So first, the context behind this reduction of education to skills training. So when the government announced this education shift, this intention to prepare the next generation for the jobs that will meet them, this of meeting the needs of the private sector, this was a shock to me. I'd imagined this separation between school and business, and this felt like a violation of sorts. Education has to be more than simply aiming towards the job you will get after school. It has to be so much more than that. This reduction can be seen as especially ineffective given that the majority of our MLAs, those responsible for the construction of our social and political context, have a liberal arts background. So if you look through government, there's not much skills training there. So this was a shock, but it isn't new, actually, this marriage of education and business. In fact, they've always been intimately connected. The rise of modern schooling after the Second World War, school as we know it, more or less, was tied to capitalist production. The most strident advocates of public education were some of the most successful businessmen of the time. A more literate workforce was needed, and school was seen to provide that. Of course, the context of work at the time was very different. It was more uniform factory work, and we can see that reflected in some of the traditional rituals of school. So what we're facing with the government's focus on skills training and corporations coming into schools, like Home Depot sponsoring a school garden, for instance, is a more explicit articulation of this relationship, but unfortunately not a new relationship, but definitely one that needs to be challenged. Second, and connected to this first feature of school, is the role of charity in schools, the way we teach children to respond to social issues through charity. When my twins started kindergarten, by the end of the first few months, they had taken part in 2 food bank drives and multiple bake sales to raise money for all sorts of good causes. And I was glad that the school was providing an opportunity for my children to think about others, but I was deeply concerned that the only solution they were learning to address issues of poverty and hunger was to donate. The slogan of our schools has become, "Bring your money." Where are the lessons about the structural causes of these societal problems and what our political institutions can do about them? So as my children were taking cans up to school, they weren't learning that 1 in 5 children in BC live in poverty and go hungry. They weren't learning about the history of food banks, how they were in fact initially meant to be a temporary measure, but they've now been around for 30 years, becoming such a normal part of society that we never question their role and the extent to which they can actually address these big issues. Kids give year after year without wondering why children are still going hungry in BC. They weren't learning how to make meaningful change, systemic change. While we may feel glad that schools are fostering some kind of social responsibility through charity, we also need to be aware of the intimate connection between charity and business and the role of charity in capitalism, not as teaching, but as an opportunity to provide spaces for fostering certain characteristics in our children. The content of the curriculum is not as important as the development of these characteristics, which are, at the very least, flexibility to face an ever-changing world, critical thinking to question and challenge the status quo, and creativity to come up with alternative solutions and ways of being. Even if we believe in preparing students for employment, we have to recognize that the context of the job market has changed substantially since the rise of modern schooling. It's no longer a job for a lifetime. It's precarious, ever-changing labor. And for this context, we need flexibility, critical thinking, and creativity. But instead of preparing students for certain jobs, we actually need to prepare them for facing the big social issues of our time: inequality, climate change, racism, sexism, colonization, and reconciliation. And for that, we need to encourage flexibility, critical thinking, and creativity. For these challenges, we also need to encourage true democratic engagement to show students how to make systemic change, to encourage them to become citizens, not just fundraisers. Democracy's been reduced to voting every 4 years, only for people over the age of 18, but it should actually be a daily activity. We should do democracy every day. For that, we need schools themselves to become sites of democracy. And we have a public school like that here in Vancouver, although it's within the Gulf Island School District. So my kids have now gone back to school, to Windsor House, which describes itself as a free democratic school. or as we call it, a school where the kids get to choose what they want to learn. And it's not that this is an exceptional group of people at Windsor House. What makes them exceptional is simply their commitment to a process of full democracy. And it's hard work. So now Finn, our failed student, has come back to life. Last week he was coming back from Southlands Farm, which is one of the Windsor House sites this year, and he saw a student holding an egg carefully in some toilet paper. Turns out the student was going to try and hatch this egg at home. Finn was thrilled with this idea and came home bursting with the desire to do the same. That night, he practiced some questions, and the very next day he asked the farmer if he could do this and how he would know if the egg was fertilized. Then he came home and looked up how to make an incubator. You gotta love YouTube for that. And this weekend, we built an incubator. And Finn is now talking about temperature and humidity, not as abstract numbers, but as something that he has to control in his incubator, unless he wants to cook his eggs instead of hatch them. The knowledge and the consequences are real, and that's something we're denying our kids in the current system. This is the way public education could be. But we need a significant reinvestment from the provincial government to get us there, to disentangle school from business and charity, to promote schools as sites of democracy and students as citizens, to bring all those students that we're currently failing back to life, to face the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish and Mike. So now what we'd like to do is to engage with you a little bit and just get your responses and your questions to this question of what are the purposes of public education?
I don't understand the Gulf Island University functioning here in the city. Can you explain?
When I was a kid, a long time ago now, one of the most important programs I was in introduced me to Bloom's taxonomy when I was 10 years old. And I don't think I would be where I am without that. And when you're talking about everything else that goes with being a student by fostering flexibility, critical thinking, creativity, I always think back to being part of that program, which was cut years ago. But I'm just wondering if this conversation on the purposes of public education doesn't exist in a vacuum. I work at UBC, and the approach to post-secondary education is very interesting when you see where the funding is going. The funding is going into those practical, applied degree programs. So you're seeing a lot of money being dumped into engineering, and we do need engineers. I'm not saying that we don't, but I know that I'm an arts graduate, and we've had that conversation about what happened to the approach to education from way back in the day, and I'm going to get the word wrong, but the quadrivium, is that what it is when you take those four, music, art, or music, philosophy, math, and astronomy, maybe? Is that right? Somebody's got to know that. And that used to be the approach to public education. So I'm just wondering if there have been conversations between your group, because this is my very first event with PENS, and kind of taking a look at the next step when you go to post-secondary, because that seems to inform how, I think it goes both ways, how it informs the K-12 system, and then when they move on to the post-secondary system, especially in university, where that kind of support and approach to education comes from.
I couldn't answer the whole question, but I think part of the issue here is who is going to be involved in determining the purposes, the principles, and the pedagogy for public education. And what has happened is we hardly even think about the pedagogy. We are thinking in terms of a curriculum that is set by government, and then there's to be some flexibility with regard to how that is taught. And what I'm saying is if we are going to grow up and become citizens, we need to contend for the purposes, the principles, and the pedagogy in our schools. And parents can play a big role in that. Teachers can play a role. Local school boards could play a role. But we have to break our dependency on government. Government cannot be the authority with respect to what is true. Government can, and think about who might be in government. with what's going on in the world today and what's gone on in the past. So we need to take responsibility for that. And so while that term insurrection is troubling to some, what it says is we are going to insert ourselves as parents, citizens, teachers, students, in what we're learning, what the purposes are, what the principles are, why we're doing it. That's our business. And when we do that, we become more democratic. I've been reading a lot about the origins of democracy, and the strength of democracy comes from the local up. So we can't afford to let somebody far away decide what is going to happen to the kids. Well, that will be as far as I could answer your question.
That's great. So we're going to move on to our second question, which is going to be addressed by Jen Stewart and Maggie Milne-Martins. Jen is going to start, and the question is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the status quo? What is the impact on BC's families?
Hi there. My name is Jennifer Stewart. I'm with Families Against Cuts to Education and the Parent Advocacy Network. And I'm a parent of 2 children, one of whom goes to school in an public elementary school in Vancouver, and one of whom goes to preschool. And so I want to talk about what happened starting in 2002. And I'm going to talk about how per-pupil funding became how we fund our schools, and what that has meant largely by looking at the number of school closures that we've seen throughout the province. So in 2002, we all know that that's the year that the class size and composition wording was stripped out of the teachers' contract. And one of the government rationales for that move was to give the school districts more flexibility. Now, why did they need flexibility? Because in 2002, in the budget, the education budget was frozen at 2001 levels for 3 years. So that meant that there was no increase even for inflation. So it was cut every year for 3 years, and also costs went up in those 3 years. As we know, MSP rates have gone up a lot since 2001, and that's just one example of costs that boards need to pay, and they were getting less money to do it. So they needed flexibility. They needed to be able to make cuts. So under the funding model that existed in 2002, the ministry was responsible for funding programs. They were responsible for deciding what programs would be cut if cuts needed to be made. Now, last year, Katie Hislop of the Tyee wrote an article about public education funding, and she posted this old column that Mike Smith wrote in March 2002, in which he talked about a document that had been leaked to him, a cabinet document dated January 2002, when they made all these changes, and signed by Christy Clark, who was then the Minister of Education. And in it, the ministry staff sets out very clearly that because of this frozen funding, the government called it protected funding, but it was a freeze, education funding will be flat. And so the current, at that time, model wouldn't work. The ministry will be called upon to make decisions about which programs to cut or reduce in order to offset unavoidable cost increases. So responsibility for cuts would rest with the ministry. So that's a problem for the government. So they wanted to shift responsibility for cuts to the districts. And so they moved to a per-pupil model to give the boards the flexibility to make the cuts that the government knew were inevitable. As the Rural Education Task Force and Mike Smith warned, many schools have been closed in the last 15 years, and most of them are in rural areas. There's 251 of them have closed. Districts in areas like the Kootenays, the Cowichan Valley, Port Alberni, Prince George, Kitimat, Ashcroft, Kamloops, Thompson, the Peace, and the Caribou-Chilcotin have all seen multiple closures in small communities. And boards continue to have shortfalls despite all these closures that they've made, so schools continue to close. But now, by 2016, we are at the point where boards are flat out stating that they're closing schools in order to balance their budgets, and not because of low enrollment in those particular schools. This was a situation in 2016 in Smithers that we saw with the Kathleen Lake School, and in Osoyoos, where the only high school in town was slated for closure. It came very close to being closed, to balance their budgets. Schools are the heart of communities in urban neighborhoods, just as they are in rural communities. Sometimes the shortfall can be made up with one-time cost savings. That's what Vancouver did for years, and Surrey did last year to the tune of $4 million. But other years, the shortfall must be made up by closing schools and or cutting programs and services, as we saw in Vancouver last year when they faced a $25 million shortfall because all the one-time funding had been used up. And the pressure to close schools is also high in urban districts because for years they faced this 95% capacity usage requirement in order to get seismic upgrading funding. So that's tied in there as well. Vancouver is predicting yet another shortfall for the coming year. And this year enrollment dropped by 206 kids, which is 0.4% of the approximately 50,000 kids that go to school in the Vancouver School Board. And it's spread across more than 100 schools, but it means for at least 0.4% less funding. And so, and also depending on how much costs go up, that's where you get your shortfall. And inflation alone is around 1.9%. So this photo that I have here is of a funeral that we had last summer when the school closures in Vancouver, potential school closures were announced. And the Parent Advocacy Network held a funeral where we listed off all 251 names of the schools that had been closed, and we rang a bell for each of them. And it was really quite something to hear all these names of all these schools and to know that each one represents a community that no longer has a school in it. So it's clear that per pupil funding has been damaging to all school districts, whether urban or rural. It's the opposite of stable and predictable, and it does not allow districts to make reliable long-term plans. The Legislative Committee on Finance and Government Services has recognized this fact and recommended a funding formula review, but that's being ignored by government. Now Linda Larson is on the case, at least in the rural context, and we'll see what she recommends. But it's clear that we need to get rid of per pupil funding in British Columbia. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maggie Milne-Martins. I am a parent of 3 children, currently in public school in Vancouver, and I'm also a representative of the Parent Advocacy Network for Public Education, which is a grassroots collective of parents, as Jen described. So public education in BC is founded on the principle that every child, regardless of race, of religion, of gender, ability, or economic means, has the right to a fully funded, accessible, quality education that enables each to, and I'm reading from the preamble, to develop their individual potential and to acquire the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to contribute to a healthy, democratic, and pluralistic society and a prosperous and sustainable economy. This is the vision of education which underwrites the BC School Act. It is a vision that recognizes the intrinsic value of every child and our collective responsibility to ensure that every child has access to an education that meets their learning needs. It is also a vision that recognizes public education as the holder and purveyor of the democratic values of our society and the foundation of our common wealth. However, this vision that has shaped our public education system in BC is in danger of being overturned. Calculated, persistent, and unrestrained underfunding, as well as regressive educational policies that seek to delimit government's fiscal and legal obligations to public education, are dismantling the very democratic principle of equity at the heart of public education. Every year, as Jen's described, school districts are forced to make cuts in staffing, in programs, in learning supports, and educational resources to balance budgets with increasingly insufficient funds. This is an indisputable fact, a fact affirmed by the government's own Select Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services and experienced every day in classrooms across the province. What is important to understand is that the cumulative impact of all these cuts are straining public education to the point of breaking. Parents are not just fundraising for Kleenex and field trips anymore. A recent survey that PAN conducted, representing the experience of 38 schools in Vancouver and 10 schools in other districts across the province, identified items that would have previously been included in a comprehensive public education that they are now fundraising for. So you have the list of items here, and which is quite overwhelming. And I want to just share with you some of the responses that were almost or consistently cited across every single survey. Those are technology in the 21st century, resource supplies, including sensory materials and equipment for special needs children, art materials and musical instruments, basic classroom supplies, including library books and graded readers, all PE equipment, including mats and balls. Imagine doing PE without balls. Curtains, furniture, including desks, cafeteria tables and chairs, gym risers, playgrounds, PE instruction, music instruction, art instruction, sexual education instruction. This subsidization is creating unacceptable inequalities between schools based on socioeconomic difference, and children are being denied access to the full educational opportunities they are entitled to under the School Act. That parents are now not only fundraising for basic educational supplies, but also for core curricular instruction is highlighting the profound depth of underfunding and the erosion of educational breadth from our schools. Government changes to graduation requirements have reduced the number of core upper-level courses needed to graduate, and also allowed students to achieve course equivalencies from other educational sources, such as private lessons. So this has had a massive impact on the breadth of education that students are now, on the breadth of education that students now have access to, particularly in the fine arts and the applied skills. Funding constraints has added to this. And the funding constraints mean that unless a course is actually full, it cannot run. And so this has further depleted the courses that are available to secondary students who are now scrambling to access the core and electives they need to graduate, are resorting to online schooling, which then again is a negative feedback loop for less courses, busing between schools, or outsourcing to other educational providers. Again, this has serious consequences for the equitable access of educational opportunities for children based on economic advantage. And furthermore, is limiting vocational and post-secondary opportunities for students who now need to pay to upgrade courses that they did not acquire in high school. This loss of breadth across the full K-12 curriculum is one of the hidden casualties of underfunding and of the adverse policies that support it. Meanwhile, government uses BC's continued high ranking on the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, on their international PISA tests to show its superlative educational outcomes and maintain the illusion that all is well. However, the PISA test, with its economic agenda, has been harshly critiqued by leading academics for its reductive vision of education. So the PISA test has been harshly critiqued by academics across the world, particularly for its reduction of what education means, its exclusion of physical, moral, civic, and artistic development, a letter that was written to the director of the OECD says, preparing young men and women for gainful employment is not the only, nor even the main goal of public education, which has to prepare students for participation in democratic self-government, for moral action, and a life of personal development, growth, and well-being. This gets to the heart of what is most perilous about the future of public education in this province, that the transformation of education that the government talks about is fundamentally altering the purpose and the intent of public education and is setting the groundwork for its whole-scale dismantling. The current BC Ed Service Plan clearly articulates the government's own reductive vision for the education system. And you can read it, the second bullet. The goal of this government is to make sure British Columbians are at the front line of 1 million job openings forecast for the BC economy. BC's education plan provides the vision for how the ministry and its partners are transforming the education system and supports the ministry's aim to consistently prepare capable young people ready to succeed in a rapidly changing world. Now, if you compare the way in which this BC service plan has adapted the preamble to the School Act, I think you can see some interesting inconsistencies. The purpose of the British Columbia school system is now to enable these students to develop their individual potential, all good, and to acquire the knowledge, skills, and abilities, not attitudes, needed to contribute to a healthy society. And by healthy society, when you read the service plan, it actually means like physical and emotional health, not political and civic health. Healthy society and a prosperous and sustainable economy. So we note the words that are excluded are attitudes, pluralistic, and democratic. This should concern us all. Public education is the place where our democratic values as a society are upheld and practiced in diverse, inclusive classrooms that are open to all and offer equal educational opportunities for every child across the curriculum in accordance with their learning needs, to allow them to reach their full potential as individuals and as citizens of our society. That is the vision that we need to hold on to. I want to read the purpose of education as written in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which puts it this way. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. This is a profoundly beautiful vision of equity and the purpose of education, which is reflected in the BC School Act. This is a vision of education that we need today more than ever before, and we need to fight for it. All of us, parents, grandparents, and citizens, we all share a collective responsibility to ensure that the democratic values of equality, tolerance, and social justice are passed on to the children who will shape our society for tomorrow. And we need to demand that government fulfill its legal responsibility to provide adequate, sustainable, and predictable funding to public education to ensure this end. The health and well-being of our whole society is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. We'll take a couple of questions maybe at the microphone. If you have a question for Maggie or Jen, we'll take some time on that. And if you haven't had a chance to pick up the handout that Maggie referenced on the back table, that's a list of all of the things that used to be covered and are now fundraised for, it really does make for shocking reading.
Hi, Jen. My name is Madeline Sauve. I wonder if anyone knows, or if you know, at what point did the funding go to a per pupil system?
In 2002.
And so, because you mentioned that the government saw, or that I thought you were referring to a point where they saw that if they went to this system, that the responsibility would rest with them to defend that or to balance that. At what point did it shift to the school board to balance that? And when did the ministry force school boards to balance budgets based on that model?
Well, so in the memo that, or it's a cabinet document, so what it is it sets out when a cabinet minister has to make a decision, and in this case to move to per pupil funding, and it sets out the sort of pros and cons of doing that. So what they were saying is that in the current model that existed when they wrote that memo, that document, if they continued with that model, then it would be the ministry and the government that would bear responsibility for making the cuts. So they needed to change to per pupil funding to essentially say, here is your packet of money to each district. Now you decide which programs that money gets spent on. So that was the change, because prior to that, the ministry was funding programs, not individual students. It was funding programs. And so if it needed to if cuts needed to be made, which they knew were inevitable because they'd frozen funding and costs were of course going up, they knew cuts needed to be made. And so this is a way to offload the making of those cuts to move to the per pupil funding and just, wash your hands. And we hear this all the time now from the Minister of Education. Every Minister of Education repeats that ad infinitum, that these are district level decisions. And they said that a lot about school closure last year. I mean, Linda Larson, right up until she was appointed parliamentary secretary for rural education, was telling her constituents that she couldn't possibly influence whether or not their school was closed because it was a district decision. So that's been the line, and this was the reason that they made this change to per pupil funding.
So those were not separate decisions. That was a consequence almost of going to that model. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what happens when you change to just saying to each district. Because what happens is they don't go to the districts and say, how much money do you need to run a successful year of education? They don't do that. They just say, here's how much money you're getting.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I'm thinking more about who holds the power within the structure to make decisions. Maggie was just talking about, the values and these different sort of documents reflecting different values. So if we think back to the beginning of the presentation, where we're talking about starting at the dinner table and talking about our values and sharing with our family what's important to us, not in the short term or not what we're frustrated with right now, but into the future, just to think about the broader picture and who has the capacity to make decisions given the model that or the structure that we're working with. So that's sort of where my question is coming from.
I don't know if this answers the question, but it goes back to the co-governance model that we're under. So if you read the Milburn report that came out from the audit of the Vancouver School Board for failing to balance their budgets and looking for criminal activity in terms of why they couldn't balance their budget. It clearly states that the minister's responsibility, and it's outlined in the School Act, is to establish the amount of money that is needed for public education. And the school districts need to exercise stewardship, which basically means cutting, in order to comply with that. So the power is in the hand of government because the money controls the decisions in many ways. So if you look at, I have the privilege of being in an inner city school. I go in and do some art there. And I watch these teachers and they have those values of inclusion, and they have democracy and equality, and they work very hard. But there is only so much you can do with the amount of money that you're given. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what the problem is that the government controls the money. They set what each school district's budget is, and they also tell the districts what they have to do. The districts have to perform, certain tasks. They have to provide a certain number of instructional hours per year or something like, and they have to do all that within this limited amount of money that they get absolutely no say over how much it is. So, and then you also have these, more sort of meta topics, such as the preamble, and then looking at what the government actually thinks education is all about by the document that Maggie was talking about, where we're moving from these broad concepts to applied job training. And so what we can read into that is just what the government thinks of public education. And we can also discern that from the way that it's treated as a cost to be cut as much as possible, a cost to be minimized, rather than as an investment and as an important feature of our province that should be maximized rather than minimized. And so all these things work together to mean that the government gives the districts as little money as it can, and they have to do the same as they did last year or more with less money. And so trustees are in a terrible position. I sort of admire and I'm sort of scared of anybody who would run to be a trustee, because the job is one of, it's a thankless job of making cuts, is what it is now. And they don't have any say over their budget, which is what makes all the difference.
But it does seem that we have these different portions at work. We have, a group of teachers working on the new curriculum, and then as you describe, it's delivered to the schools, and the teachers are expected to deliver this new curriculum with very few resources. And so, there's a quality and a depth and an experience, a professional experience in that new curriculum, but then how is that being supported? And so if we have the BC Jobs Blueprint that, has kindergartners wearing hard hats, then how do we then solve that in cohesion within the system? So I'm just thinking about the larger system as well, and just trying to see that broader perspective.
Yeah, I think the question is, who is the BC curriculum for? And we know that marketing the BC curriculum internationally is a major economic venture for this current government. It is called the Quality Assurance brand. And so there is an investment in this curriculum. Yeah. I also know that many teachers have worked on the curriculum, but to a point, and then it's filtered through various agencies. So for example, the tests that are being written for the upper levels are not being written by public school teachers, because the government refused to not let the information be public domain, so it could be used as a ranking system. So, there's input from teachers into the content of that, and you can see, movement towards more autonomy and student-centered learning and all of those things that Trish was talking about, but without the money to implement it, really, it's a sham.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, we're gonna move on. So we've had the first question was looking at the purpose of education. Then with Maggie and Jen, we've been looking really at the status quo, and I think there seems to be a bit of a contrast there. Our third and final question really is asking, how do we bridge that? And the question is, how might we redirect towards the purpose of public education, or reimagine public education for the greater good? So to answer that, I'll turn it over to Bill Bruneau and Alex Hemingway.
Right. My name is Bill Bruneau. I just want to bring up one fact to help with the previous presentations, which were excellent, I thought. It is the fact that in 2001, Gordon Campbell brought in a 25% tax cut. There's a reason why education funding and social service funding at all levels has been cut as severely and drastically as it has. And part of that reason has to do with the broader vision of reducing common public good services in every sense, right across the board. And you start by reducing the tax burden, as they like to say. And ever since, and that includes NDP governments, not just Liberal governments, we've had that same problem. An inadequate vision of what it is that we're trying to do for the sake of the common good. And for me, it starts in 2001 with that tax cut, income tax cut, 25%, never reversed. And I have a few ideas, and Alex has quite a few as well, so we're going to just move right along to them. I want to say about the governance and the role of school boards, just one brief thing, I guess, and that is that I was a school trustee myself from 1990 to 1993, and my view is that our job was to be whipping boys and whipping girls, depending on the gender of the school trustee. Really, that was our job. The government got to do what it liked and blamed us. We had virtually no discretion and certainly very few means. So I can just underline 3 times what previous speakers have said, and very well too. So thank you very much. Over the past 3 months, BC's government has followed an old tradition. They've been promising money for roads, bridges, agriculture, media-based industry, and housing. It's election time. But people are skeptical. Suddenly the government has discovered that it has a $2 billion budget surplus. So why has there been so little talk about public commitment to schooling, not to mention public health and social services? A huge majority of voters strongly support public education and are worried about its direction and future. Yes, roads and bridges are nice, but our kids and our common good are essential, not just nice. Several of us met last October, as was said before, with the Legislative Standing Committee on Finances and Government Services. We were there to make the case for public education at all levels, K through PhD. Indeed, for 15 straight years, that committee has heard the same song from us, people like us, that public demand for public education funding, equally and equitably provided, is absolutely central, or should be central, to the work of our society. And for 15 straight years, the committee has reported to the legislature that message from us, the public. And for 15 straight years, the government has spent less, not more, of the GDP, the gross domestic product, on public education. If you could put Alex Hemingway's graph up, I'd be delighted. So the guy to my left here, Alex Hemingway, has done a graph that shows what percentage of the gross domestic product, the general economic output of goods and services. So the government has chosen to avoid or to ignore the question. Perhaps the government is embarrassed. After all, they signed a contract in 2002 that promised a permanent reduction of class size, necessary resources for special ed, and a renewed commitment to specialist teaching. The government passed a law stripping those provisions from the contract, as we all know, and in each year since 2002, the government has saved the equivalent of about $300 million in our money. That's $2017. I make that to add up to $4.5 billion in 2017 funds. That happens to be the same amount if you look at the annual budget figures of the province of British Columbia. That's exactly the same amount that we spend on the whole of the budget of public schools in 1 year, $4.5 billion. So we've actually saved, that is, we've stripped out of the system $4.5 billion just for these things from the teacher's contract, without talking about all the other things that previous speakers have discussed already. It reminds me of a story in the New York Times this week about the so-called Spider-Man burglar, the fellow who in 2010 robbed a Paris museum of art worth $115 million, including a few Picassos. He was convicted of the crime a couple of weeks ago. He announced on Thursday, 3 days ago, in a Paris courtroom, in lovely French too, educated guy, this burglar, that it was easy to get away with the heist. The security system was run by amateurs. And besides, I was lucky. Now, the decision to hold back $4.5 billion over 15 years is probably not robbery, but it's vandalism. Those several 100,000 children who passed through the system in that period without the benefit of reasonable class sizes, fair special needs provision, and specialist teaching have paid the price for those cuts. You might say this amounts to vandalism, I think. The government might have thought it could duplicate the feats of the Spider-Man art thief, but it's up to us to prove them wrong. It is an election year, after all. I want to make two major points and draw this to a close. First, about the money. We should not be distracted by the funding provided under last fall's Supreme Court decision. Yes, it's good to have that money, but it merely takes us back to funding levels in 2002. That's nowhere near good enough. And the second point I would make is that we British Columbians have an encouraging history of public pressure and parent involvement in education. We can stop this, and we can reverse it. It's a history well worth remembering in this election year. Yes, our schools are good. Despite the fiscal neglect of the past 15 years, our teachers are well trained. They should be better supported, of course. I'm thinking a 10% increase would be nice in 2017, 18, and 19, and maybe 10% more in 19, 20. So that would be 20%. That's a sensible, realistic, modest goal for the period ending 2020 in those 4 years. I'm thinking down the road to 2079, when we're going to have made a lot more progress than that. So I'm calling for 20% just in the next 3 or 4 years. I'm being nice. Really, it should be more. The system truly has reached a breaking point. We just can't afford to wait much longer. No more efficiencies are possible without compromising it. There is a way forward, and what I think we could do maybe in the last portion of this section between Alex and me is talk about some of the devices that are open to us as political actors to turn this thing around. I make a general point while I'm at it too, and then we'll close this thing off. Our politicians often speak of making kids ready for the new economy. It was mentioned just a second ago. Even while they neglect the scientific, literary, and arts education that's required to do critical thinking. And I mean from grade 1 on. I don't mean just at UBC or SFU or UVic or wherever. We have suggestions for the government and the governments to come. I would like to summarize them under one wide-ranging idea, the idea of critical thinking. So I'm going to underline that one from previous speakers. There hasn't been as strong a demand for critical thinking in education since the late 1930s, when Vancouver newspapers were worried about educating kids to see the difference between fascism in Germany and Italy at the time, so we're talking Hitler, Mussolini, and so on, and democracy here at home. That problem has returned to haunt us. Our kids and their parents really do want to understand why things are as they are in the Middle East and Africa. They want to see the point of political action and involvement here in Canada. They want to think critically about pipelines, Indigenous rights, immigration and multiculturalism, electoral reform, the design of our cities as the population grows. And they want to think on all sides of all of those issues not just the left side or the right side, all sides. We should be part of that, and our kids should be ready for that debate, and that's what I'm calling for.
Thanks, Bill. I think what I'll do is I'm just going to come up to the front here and make a few more comments on the finances. Really just, oh, I guess this mic is already hooked up. Should I?
It's fine.
Okay, I better not, in case it does something weird. I just really want to reinforce a couple of the points that have already been made by Bill and Jennifer and others on the finance component of all this. You know, sometimes a reaction to some of the excellent discussion we've had so far today might be that, boy, it would be nice to reinvent our education system in the way that we're talking about and reinvest in it, but it's not realistic. It's not possible. That's often put to us out in the world, and it's just not so. And you know, so one example of that is the figure that's up there right now, looking at, you know, in terms of trying to understand what we can afford when it comes to reinvesting in education, looking at the share of our total economic pie that we invest in the system is one of the best metrics we have. And that, as you see up there, and as Bill has described, we've actually seen a significant decline in education funding as a share of our gross domestic product. And you know, if you take the operating grant number there, for example, it's about a 0.9% of GDP decline. What that means in practice, what that gap, 0.9% of GDP, actually amounts to $2 billion a year that could be reinvested in the system if we only were investing at the same rate of our economy as we were in 2001. So, you know, a lot is possible from that perspective. And you know, that the other point I would just add is that decline is not just an artifact of declining enrollment, which is of course now on the rise again, but in BC we have the second lowest education funding on a per student basis as well. So just wanted to reinforce that. And so before I kick it back over to Bill to lay out for us some really interesting historical examples of successful parent advocacy around education funding and pushing reinvestment in education, I thought I might just share, you know, my own personal experience with something that Jen was describing earlier, which is the cuts that came in 2002. I was graduating high school in Prince George in 2002, and we saw these really extraordinary levels of cuts in the Prince George School District. I'd have to go back and double check the number, but we're talking about between 15 to 25 schools being shuttered within 1 or 2 years in one city, in one school district. And at the time, parents, students, including myself, were advocating against this and pushing hard against this, and actually asking our school district, our school trustees, to say no to implementing this cut, something that we've seen resurrect itself again this year. And at the time, the school trustees, you know, told us accurately, but not particularly valorously, that if they refused to implement the cuts, they would be fired and replaced by the province, which is absolutely true. And of course, so they didn't do that. They went ahead and implemented it despite thousands of students and parents showing up at their meetings. Now, I don't say that to, in a way, I guess I'm prefacing Bill's stories of successful advocacy with a story of failed advocacy, but I don't view it as a pessimistic story in a way, because one of the things I would just take note of is the difference in the social and political moment between the early 2000s and where we are today. At the time, we were in the midst of a push to shrinking the role of government in society, including the education system, sort of the height of neoliberalism, if you will. Today we're in a very interesting moment, a scary moment in some ways, but it's a moment of flux where there's a lot more openness and openings to push to reinvest in the public good and the public sphere. And before we go and hear some of those stories from Bill, I'll just make one more point on the financial side, which is, I showed you the declining share of education funding as a share of GDP. Here's our overall provincial public spending as a share of GDP. This is, in one graph, in a way, the shrinking of BC's public sphere over the past 15 years. It's not an iron law. It's not inevitable. It's a consequence of specific policies that, for example, Bill mentioned, such as tax cuts that today mean that a household in BC's top 1% pays $40,000 less per year in taxes than they did at the beginning of the 2000s. So nothing inevitable about it, and maybe Bill can tell us more about not inevitabilities of cuts in education.
Well, I guess I'm going to tell two stories. One is it's a shocker. It's the story. I've got three here, and I don't have much time, so I'm just going to maybe pick two of them. One is the story of the successful passage of a law that made it possible for the government to offer up to 50% of per pupil funding to private schools. Now that legislation was passed in 1977. We moved here, my family, my two kids, my wife and I, in 1971. Our kids were all going through public school at the time, and this really surprised us. We just didn't notice what was going on in the background politically, socially, in the province, and particularly in the Lower Mainland, from the late 1960s, before we got here, and the early 1970s, right up to 1978, when the government passed Bill 33, which is the essential legislation that permitted this. So it's an interesting story because one of the things that made the government take courage and pass that law was parental involvement. It was parental involvement from Dutch Calvinist immigrants between Langley, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, and so on. We can say ethnically that there's a clear characterization here. The Federation of Independent School Associations, which was founded in 1966, had been pushing for public funding for private schooling for several years already in the late 1960s, from 1966 on. So they had that too. They had an ethnic group and a province-wide organization of volunteers like yourselves, except on the other side of the spectrum, i.e. they were for private schooling. They spent a certain amount of money on publicity and advertising in what was then the press. That is, in those days, something that appeared on pieces of paper. There were 3 or 4 of them in the Lower Mainland, and there were weeklies as well. Now we're down to possibly 1/4 as many pieces of paper that are available to us to advertise in. But we have the social media and all sorts of other methods that we could use to get the message out. But the 2 key ingredients were the decision to go with an ethnically remarkable, solid base group which could reliably provide money, time, and energy for the campaign to bring in public funding for private schools, and FISA, the Federation of Independent School Associations. And I want to go on. It wasn't just the Dutch Calvinists. It was German-speaking Protestants. And of course, one of the largest groups of all, I still haven't mentioned, which is the Catholics. Catholic education in British Columbia was not provided under a separate school system the way it is in the other 9 provinces. It had all been private until 1978. And the Catholic parents in the province, and I understand their position to some extent, felt that this just wasn't fair. If the rest of the country could produce public education funded 100%, why couldn't we do that in British Columbia, funded 100%? Well, they never got 100%, but they certainly have got between 30 and 50, depending on the budget of the school involved. So the decision to be frank about this and to be clear about where your constituencies are, not to be shy, but to go out and do hard-nosed politics and to organize provincially through a thing like FISA. Well, you have PAN and PACE and so on. You have the elements of a framework. Whether you're tough-minded enough and mean enough to do what FISA did and the various groups that constitute that interest group, I'm not sure. I think we should be free and willing to do what has to be done to achieve our objectives. I could give a long list of reasons, but you've heard them all from the group. One last example. I live on 16th Avenue. Down the street from my house is Lord Byng School. It opened in 1925. Further down the street is UBC, which also opened in 1925 on the Point Grey campus. It had opened earlier, 10 years earlier, in a rather nasty bunch of shacks over by what used to be the old VGH. What happened in 1925? Why suddenly did the government find millions of dollars on the order of $4.5 million back when $1 million was worth a heck of a lot more than it is now? We would be talking hundreds of millions now in realistic terms. Why did they do that? It's because between 1920 and 1925, there had been street marches. Marches matter. They always have. There was a Lulu in 1922 called the Great Trek, which involved a stream of volunteers, many of them ordinary parents, high school students, elementary school students. They said that they were marching for post-secondary education funding, but it was also for secondary school funding. They wanted to get rid of tuition fees, which still had to be paid for secondary education back in those days. So people wanted free secondary education, and they got their way. So the result of a massive public demonstration of neighborhood organizations with pieces of paper taped on the front doors of something like 18,000 households all over Vancouver was that the Liberal government of the day, it's all their same government, not the same Liberals, but another Liberal government, found that it was embarrassed to continue with its short-sighted and Scroogey attitude to education funding and reversed course in 1924-25. Last thing, the parents of the day asked for a rethink, a fundamental reconsideration of what the purposes and organization of public education should be, and said, let's have a Royal Commission about this. And there was one called the Putman-Weir Report. It's online, and in fact, if you email me, I'll be happy to tell you, give you URLs for that Royal Commission and many subsequent ones, some of which are monumentally boring. But the 1925 one is not boring. It's a remarkable document that shows how quickly government can be made to respond to parental action. A lot of it sounds old-fashioned, but I don't think that the politics have changed all that much in that period.
Thanks, Bill and Alex. And just on a personal note, my own grandfather was part of the Great Trek to UBC. And in fact, it was so important to our family that it made it into his obituary. And yes. Thank you very much, everyone. It's just, there's so much to think about. My head is almost swimming. I think what we could do is take some time, if you want to get up at either of these microphones. If you have some questions for our panelists or you'd like to make a comment, we can take some time to do that before we close. And I know folks will want to be getting home given the weather.
I'd just like to say that I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and I really want it to work out because we have the teachers that are trying so hard, and we have the people, so there must be a way for everything to go right. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that was lovely. Do any of the panelists want to make any additional points, something some of you have been jotting away, I see?
I just wanted to respond to some of your comments. Coming from England, politicians put their kids in public schools. You know, even you think about our conservative prime minister we had just recently, David Cameron. You know, his kids were in private school, but when he was elected, he put them in public school. Like, this is just something expected from politicians in England. Then there's a shame if you wouldn't do that, because you're the person responsible for public education and other public services. So shouldn't you put your families on the line, basically? And the fact that we don't do that here always seems odd to me. I feel like that should be something that goes along with those positions of power and responsibility, that their kids should be at stake, and then perhaps they would care more.
Well, I've learned lots from this. I think part of this is we're too politically passive. When we find that our government is elected and does things that a government committed to democracy would not do, we seem to feel, well, the rules require that we put up with it. I don't think they do. And I think the examples that we give back of those examples is to say we won't accept it. We simply won't accept it. And my dad went off to fight in World War II. And his generation were told, and they believed, that they were fighting for democracy. But they did not have a democracy here at that time. There was a class system. And there was massive inequality. When they came back, they expected we would begin to make our society more equal, more fair. And the importance of children here is you can't assign a child to a different set of opportunities and say you have a democracy. You don't. Democracy isn't just a bunch of rules. It's a relationship of covenantal caring for one another, and that nobody gets left behind. So I just feel, and the examples that Bill gave and others, that we need to take the wraps off. And I'm not talking about being violent or anything like that, but that we need to become much more assertive, and that we're not going to accept our trustees being fired, for example. We're not going to accept that a government can put a curriculum together, or aspects of our curriculum, or remove things from a curriculum that deny the kind of education we should have. So I think we've made those points, but I just think we have to suck it up and give them a bit of a battle. Thanks.
Well, in that case, I think what we'll do is I'll just want to make a few thank yous, and I would invite you to join us for refreshments as well. Tonight's talk has been very provocative, and our planning committee, our thinking on this was really to just consider funding, not just at looking at the numbers, but to really go, you know, why do we do this? Why is it important? And to find that touchstone. And so that's what we've tried to do this evening, is just to really look at the value of public education, and to, when we make arguments for funding, that we continue to bring forth the idea of the principles and the values that drives that. It's not just about money, but that we can do something that is actually, if we imagine it, we can actually build something that's really terrific. Tonight's event has been a group effort. I do want to thank Michael Zlotnick and Trish Garner and Maggie Milne-Martins and Jen Stewart and William Bruno and Alex Hemingway, our panelists. Special thanks to Paul Shaker of Your Education Matters for support of this event. And a video will be available at www.youreducationmatters.ca. I'd like to thank our planning committee, which is Sandra Bruno, George Davison, Maggie Milne-Martins, and Michael Zlotnick. Also sama to Mark, to Amjo Hall, to Ruby Eng, Gian Ping, Fiorella Pinillo, Steve Zlotnick, and Sama Jaffer. And finally, I just want to say, looking out of the audience tonight, it's a small group, but it's a committed group, and we really appreciate your making the effort. Even when the weather is better, there's so many competing demands on our time, so thank you for making it a priority and making that effort. I also want to mention just finally that on March 8th there will be another event. This is hosted by the Institute for Public Education. It's called How Education Funding Matters. That's on March 8th here at SFU Woodwards. If you haven't already, we've got some buttons at the back that say I vote for strong public schools. Do take them with you. There's also lots of handouts, including the Charter for Public Education. Thank you and good evening.